my personal way out in left field inflammatory stance is I don't think we have a shred of free will. Despite 95% of philosophers, and I think probably the majority of neuroscientists, saying that we have free will in at least some circumstances, I don't think there's any at all. And the reason for this.
So that was quite an absolutist statement from Dr. Sapolsky, and I've read his book Behave. I think he's a phenomenal researcher, and the reason why this was a bit shocking to me is that it's very black and white. He's making a very strict absolutist claim here, and in the first chapter of this book, he really talks about how important nuance is, which is why I was surprised because there's no nuance in that sentence, right? We don't have a shred of free will. You've obviously written a book called Free Agents, How Evolution Gave Us Free Will. I'm reading it at the moment, and it's very fascinating. It's really, really interesting. It's a great book. You obviously have a sort of a counter argument to that. So I'm kind of curious on why you think Sapolsky thinks this and why you think any differently. Maybe we'll start off
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. I guess I can't speak to why Robert thinks the way that he does. I mean,
Uh-huh.
he makes an argument. I understand the argument, but I can also see where he makes some leaps in the argument, and also he brings a certain kind of a premise, philosophically speaking. He brings a philosophy to looking at the same evidence that I look at, right? I mean, what's interesting is that two neuroscientists can look at the same sort of body of evidence, basically all of neuroscience, and come to very different conclusions. So on that bit, the premise that he starts with, and I think he probably would argue that he doesn't, but I think he does, is really a dualist one. So which he lampoons. So he sets up this idea of free will where you are somehow in charge of things, but it's not you're not using your brain to do it. It's this disembodied self, right? And he sets that up as a ridiculous idea, which in a sense it is, right? It's a supernatural kind of framing. But then he goes on to say, to argue that any sort of explanation that's involving your brain in the mechanisms of decision making isn't you doing it. And so he adopts the very sort of stance that he ridicules, and so you'll never get to a kind of a free will that would satisfy him if he's looking for this dualist kind of magical thing, I think. And he so I mean, both of us would agree that there's lots of influences on our behavior, right?
Yeah.
So past human evolution, our own genetics. I mean, that's what that course that you took with me
Yeah.
was all about, right?
Yeah.
It's what my prior book, Innate, was all about,
Yeah.
was genetic influences on our personalities and predispositions and so on. And then, of course, we learn from our experiences. Now, what he says is that all of those things together, all of those influences, completely rule out any scope for you to be involved in making a decision, right? They collectively configure your brain in such a way that in any scenario that you could ever encounter, there will always be only one thing that will happen because of the computations in your brain, right? Which I think is just, well, first of all, there's no evidence for that, right? There's no evidence for the main claim of his book. He just provides no evidence for it. He provides loads of evidence for the other bits, which they all make it seem like, oh, there's this huge effects of genes and there's huge effects of past environment and so on. And I think he hopes that the weight of those impressions will lead people to just believe
Yeah.
that collectively those things leave no room for you to do anything. And I just disagree. All of those influences are, in fact, exactly the thing that allow you to do something, that allow you to know what to do, that allow you to be yourself through time or to be an entity through time. I mean, evolution has packed us full of pre-configured control policies and motivations and drives that keep us alive. And our genetics has given us some individual variation on that general human nature. And then all of our experiences are the things we've learned from, right? All our memories, all our ongoing projects and goals, all the habits and things that we've developed are exactly what we bring to decision making, right? It's that history that makes us who we are, but it doesn't preclude options. It generates options. Right?
Hmm.
It's because we can think about things, because we can think, oh, well, I see this person and I remember them, but I'm in this scenario and there's a few things I could do. And the last time I did this, it didn't work out well. And on the other hand, there's a threat over here and an opportunity over here. That's what we need cognition for.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's nothing about it that's pre-statable, that's
Okay.
that's predetermined. It's really genuinely open.
So how do you or what's your strongest argument against this sort of physical determinism that I think is at the heart of this argument of free will?
Yeah.
That, all of our thinking modules and cognitive modules that give us the ability to think, you can kind of keep going and slicing the layers and going down and down and down, and you've neural circuits, then you've neurons, and then you go all the way down to subatomic particles, and in the end all of that is inherently deterministic. And we only have like an illusion of free will because the information is abstracted on so many different layers.
Yeah.
um which part of that do you think, where does the free will emerge? If we
Oh,
are underlying, subatomic particles
yeah.
fighting against thermodynamics,
Yes.
where does the determinism fall down? Where does the free will, where does the agency come from?
Yeah. The determinism falls down at the very first step. It physics just doesn't make that claim, right? So, I mean, well, physicists may make that claim, but first of all, at the quantum level, we know it's fundamentally indeterministic, right? We know, for example, uh, well, let me back up. The idea of determinism would be that the state of the universe at any given moment, exhaustively defined, plus the laws of physics, completely determine the next future state of the whole universe, right? Or any closed system. And there's just something inevitable about that. And of course, that it also determines the next state and the next and the next and the next forever, right? There's just one sacred timeline that can't be deviated from, and there are no real choices in that kind of scenario. And everything I'm saying right now and everything you're saying was determined at the moment of the Big Bang, and that information was somehow actually physically encoded in the structure of the universe at the Big Bang, right? So that's a ridiculous and absurd assertion, and physics doesn't actually support that. So first of all, at the quantum level, you can't define the state of a system exhaustively at any moment because of things like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which just says that there's particles or fields or whatever just don't have defined pairs of values of things like position and momentum, right? The more precisely one is defined, the less precisely the other one is defined. That's just a mathematical relationship between them. And also because of the way things progress in quantum systems, the Schrodinger equation, which describes how quantum fields will evolve, is very deterministic, but it is only determining probabilities. And once something actually happens, once there's some kind of interaction that forces a collapse of the system, or a resolution of those probabilities into one actuality, then that's actually random, as far as we can tell, right? And then, so people will say, okay, well, that's all quantum stuff, right? But when things get big, like us, like classical systems, well, we know that's deterministic,
It
right?
averages out, becomes,
Yeah,
yeah. Yeah.
that's the idea. But in fact, there's no evidence that classical physics is deterministic either. It's just an assumption
Hmm.
of physics. It's not a result of physics. And you could say, so there's an argument that for classical physics to be deterministic, so for some future state to be completely determined, the equations don't have randomness in them, but the initial conditions that you're starting with can't be exhaustively defined,
Hmm.
right? They can't be defined with infinite precision, because it would take infinite space in order to do that.
Yeah.
And so if there's some little bit of indefiniteness in the parameters of the system right now, then that's not going to make much difference at the next time step or the next or the next. But now it's going to start to make a little difference. And so it depends on what kind of system you're looking at. So if you're looking at the orbits of the planets where Newton started,
Yeah.
they're really linear, right? So a little bit of imprecision here, equals just a little bit of imprecision 1,000 years from now.
Right, right.
But if you're studying complex systems that have lots of dynamic interacting feedback loops,
Yeah.
then a little bit of imprecision now gets magnified to make it, for example, say we're studying the weather, we can predict an hour from now, okay, not so much in Ireland, right?
Yeah, it depends where you are. In Spain,
Yeah,
in Spain it's pretty good, but in Ireland definitely not.
yeah, exactly. But we're not so good a week from now, and we have zero power a year from now, right? I can't tell you what the weather's going to be like, and it's not just that we don't know; it's that there's no answer to that question yet. So, so it's weird to me that the debate in free will just everyone just like assumes determinism is true and then works from there when it's weird. Like physics just doesn't say that.
And do you think that that imprecision, that intrinsic randomness, is the essential aspect that actually gives us the free will? You know, so like the fact that there is on a as small a level as you go down to subatomic particles, that it's non-deterministic and that it is random. There's a probability distribution of events that could occur, that the system could evolve in a distribution of different ways. Is that also the way behavior works, where if I'm in a bar and I'm looking across and there's an attractive girl that I want to talk to, there's a distribution of events that could occur. Some events are completely outside the scope of what could happen, and some are inside. So, we don't either have complete free will or free will doesn't exist. There's bounded constraints on our free will based on our perceptions, based on our genetics, based on all of the other factors. And that's maybe all the way down to the level of atomic particles because of that inherent randomness. Do you think that
Yeah.
that's appropriate?
Well, so it's not quite because I think when we do like your description of the sort of bounded rationality, the decision making is, I think, quite right. But I don't think it directly hinges on these random events down at subatomic particles. So there's a kind of a common rejoinder when people will say, look, either physics is deterministic at the low levels, in which case you don't decide anything, or physics is random at the low levels, and because you're not controlling the randomness, you don't decide anything. Now, both of those views are they're seeing all of the causation in the system as at the lowest levels, right? So they're both very reductive views, and it's a kind of an eliminative view. It's like all the causation is exhausted down at the lowest levels, even if some of the things are not predetermined, the way they play out is still going to manifest in the way your brain is configured and eventually your behavior. So the key thing, and this is really the key part of the argument that I make in the book and that many other people have made as well, is that it's not that there's random events happening at the low levels. It's the fact that there's some noise, right? There's some looseness to the system. So it's just not the case that what's happening at the lowest levels necessarily determines the next state. And what that means is that the way that the system is organized can do some work, right? There's some scope, there's some causal slack in the system. That means organizing the system a certain way can constrain the possibility space, right? So you've got some bunch of atoms, they're bouncing around and they're doing some random jitters and so on, but you can constrain them to to go down one sort of path or another, right? And I mean, we just see that in the physical world all the time. We see it in the devices that we're using right now. They're designed to constrain the movements of electrons, right? And in a way that doesn't, it's not messing with the randomness. It's not reaching down and poking quantum stuff. It's not violating the laws of physics or adding any sort of magical stuff. It's just setting the possibility space. But the important thing is that in our design machines, it's doing that for a function, right? There's a functionality to it. So it's organized the way it is for a reason, and it allows functions to be executed, basically. And so what I would say is that living systems take advantage of exactly the same thing. There's some slack at the lower levels, and to be a living system is just to be a system for the simplest things of just chemical reactions that are organized in such a way as to keep themselves going and resist the second law of thermodynamics. So the study of biology just is the study of organization through time and persistence through time. So what that means is that the indeterminacy, some indefiniteness at the lowest physical level, is not sufficient to give us free will or control, but it's a requirement, right? If we didn't have that, we wouldn't. There'd be nothing to talk about. There'd be no choices. No complex systems would ever evolve. In fact, in my view, and so instead, what you can think of is okay. Now you get systems that evolve. They've got some noisy stuff going on inside them, but they have enough organizational sort of regime of constraints to keep the whole system going in the way that they want it to go. And so you can think about that just in terms of homeostasis, just the thing keeping itself alive and keeping all its parameters within the set points that it likes. But you can expand the idea to systems of behavioral control.
Yeah. Yeah, no, this makes sense to me. This is why I was very shocked at him saying that he doesn't believe we have a shred of free will. Like I would suspect the answer is somewhere in the middle, like it usually is with science. It's nuanced and it's complicated.
Sure.
I'm curious on your perspective on, is this even ever falsifiable? Will we ever conduct an experiment and then a paper is released and say, here it is, free will, we have this much free will and we've quantified it with this. Like, is it ever actually possible to even get an answer to this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's funny because someone asked me this yesterday. They were saying, how could you prove free will?
Yeah.
And I said, well, why do you think the burden of proof is on me? I mean,
Yeah.
I'm making
You
a
need to
claim
do it now. Why haven't you done it already?
I mean, I'm making a claim that's perfectly congruent with all of our experience,
Yeah.
right? The phenomenology of our lives that we go around, we're making decisions, we're thinking
Yeah.
about what to do, we're acting for our reasons, and we can tell people those reasons and so on. So for me, it's the people who are claiming we have
Burden of proof
no
should be
free
on the other
will.
side. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The burden
Yeah.
should be on them. And there are many experiments that people could point to where they say, look, in this case, well, actually, they don't say in this case. They just say, look, you weren't aware of the decision, or you weren't in control of your behavior, or you don't know why you made a decision. A thought just popped into your mind. And of course, there are scenarios like that, right? There are scenarios where you don't know why you did something, where you didn't have a good reason, and it seemed, maybe it was a bit random, whether you took the left road or the right road to work, and it doesn't make much difference, right? They're the same length, and you're like, I don't care. Um, that doesn't mean that every decision is like that. Right? So just because you can point to some decisions that are habitual or automatic, or where we're not really thinking about things, we don't know why we did something, doesn't mean we never make deliberative decisions. So I think there's been a lot of that kind of extrapolation in the literature, especially the discussions around that seem to come from neuroscience experiments or social psychology experiments or things like that, that just isn't warranted, right? Because um, we're not talking about a scenario that's absolutist and defined in some logical mathematical terms where one exception falsifies the claim. It's perfectly possible in biology to say, well, sometimes it's like this and sometimes it's like that. And so it's a weird, I get frustrated by some of those over extrapolations by people who should just know better than that, in my mind.